So I encourage you, when you have some time to go home and really reflect on your own, that Isaiah 42 couldn't be a more appropriate text for our world. And I want to talk about why that is and what contextually is going on at this part of Isaiah. Because you know that Isaiah is actually 3 different books, right? There's 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah. There was probably at some point early in the 8th century, there was an actual prophet named Isaiah, but it wasn't uncommon for other people to speak in a prophet's name, in a famous prophet's name. So probably the authors of what we now have as 2nd and 3rd Isaiah weren't the same guy, and they were probably, we can tell from textual clues, that they came around a couple centuries later. So 1st Isaiah was in the 8th century, and the reason that's important was that it was during the Assyrian issue. All right? 2nd Isaiah happens a couple centuries later, or really a little over a century and a half later, and that comes along during the Babylonian issue. And then 3rd Isaiah is writing about a century after that, a half century after that, and he's writing during the Persian issue. So just remember that for now, because I know I'm saying a lot of just sort of factoids, but Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and then the Persians. And the reason that's important, because Israel's entire history is one of going from one tyrannical force occupying and controlling their nation to the next. So it starts with Egypt, and then they have a brief spell that we really don't know much about, but they have a brief spell of relative freedom from tyranny in between Egypt and Assyria, and that lasts a couple centuries. And there was probably tribal factions that went back and forth. There was probably, thank you, sir. Appreciate that. Yeah, God bless you. There were probably tribal factions going back and forth and fighting each other for territory on a relatively small scale, but there weren't what we think of as giant empires trying to take over one another. That really starts with Assyria. And the reason I want to talk about these ancient empires is because I think sometimes people read the Bible and we say, okay, there's this overarching narrative of the Bible of peace and God's nonviolent overcoming of pain and suffering and evil and power and all of these things, right? That's this overarching narrative. But then people get hung up on sort of accidental details, right? Have you noticed that happens? Sometimes people read their Bible and they lose sight of the forest and see only these trees, these accidental details. And the way that works normally is I see, okay, well, this teaching from Ephesians lines up with the particular family system, the mores and the moral system that I was raised with. So I'm gonna say that is the main thing that Scripture has to say right now, and use it to fight my social or political battle, right? I'm going to make that writ large, and I'm going to expect this one verse from Ephesians to dictate to everyone how they should live the rest of their life, because it happens to line up with what I believe and the customs that I was raised with in my tiny little village or my neighborhood where I was raised, right? That's the way that pans out. And it would be comparable to Harry Potter's a series that most people are familiar with, right? So basically Harry Potter is about good and evil, right? And good being this band of kids working together in solidarity with one another, reinforcing each other's weaknesses with strengths, and learning to work together to overcome one would-be all-powerful evil entity, right? We could almost call Voldemort a deity in the Harry Potter universe. And the way most people read the Bible is what they would say is, Harry Potter is basically a series about a sorting hat. And we should all make our decisions all the time using a sorting hat. And we should write laws around sorting hat issues, and we should make all our decisions about who we're going to marry and what country we're going to fight and all of this. It should all be determined by a sorting hat, right? Well, come on, that's like a ridiculous way to read Harry Potter, right? The sorting hat is like this relatively minor kind of fun thing, and I'm sure the Harry Potter scholars in here could tell me the deeper significance of the sorting hat. But it's like, it's basically not the main thing. I think I can safely say J.K. Rowling, if she were here today, she would say, no, I would probably take the sorting hat out of the story entirely if I knew that people were getting hung up on that. But that's how people read the Bible, and nobody seems to think it's weird that we get hung up on well, that tree's an aspen, that tree's a poplar, and not like even recognizing there's a main forest here, and the forest is a God of peacemaking and nonviolence overtaking a people and a way of life that is addicted to violence. So I like Father John Deere, the peace activist. He says what a church is, what a church should be, is a 12-step program for people who are addicted to violence. And the reason he can say it that way so bluntly and it be so true, so on point for this entire 1,400-page book, is because if you read the actual narrative arc, you're watching Israel get bounced back and forth by these powers that be. They go from Egypt, which has enslaved them and has these brutal, probably practices, because the ancient world and slavery is a brutal thing in the ancient world. In the ancient world, we don't know that much about Egypt. Actually, we do know that by the time that the 8th century rolls around, and the Assyrians are overtaking the Near Eastern world, we know that Assyria was one of the most brutal empires that ever existed. They basically, it was custom. Every kingdom and empire would basically slaughter every man, woman, and child in a town, or drag them off to exile if they were useful. That was common practice. So when we read about the Israelites going into neighboring tribes and doing that, like that's not something that they would have found shocking in the ancient world. I think for good reason we do find it shocking in our world. That's a change, a really good one, I think. But no one would have read that in the ancient world and said, well, that's really shocking that they would have done that. But what made Assyria different was they would do things that were just gratuitous in terms of trying to make the point that they were the big kid on the block in the Near Eastern world. So, like, they invented forms of torture that a lot of which I can't talk about in church, but everybody in the ancient world, when the Bible's being written, would have known about this. That for instance, they would take the governors of the provinces that they would overcome, and they would try to see how many organs they could remove while keeping the person alive. So I think that's like Tomorrow Never Dies, the James Bond movie, where that guy's like an expert in torture. That's nothing new. Like, that's been around for a while, and the Assyrians basically invented that. The Assyrians were known for completely destroying a town and burning everything with people inside each of the buildings, just to inflict the maximum amount of terror. So until this time, other kingdoms and tribes they might cart you off to exile and then burn your town, but the Assyrians would burn you down with the town. Then the Babylonians come along, and the Babylonians are brutal as well. They do a lot of we think of drawing and quartering as kind of like a medieval thing. The Babylonians were doing that. The Babylonians would basically cut off all your limbs and then let you wander around until you starved to death because you had no means of feeding yourself. Then the Persians come along, and the Persians are known for being, now we're up to the 6th century, when King Cyrus of Persia in 539 BC, when he takes over, and they're known for being relatively lenient. They're kind of like the cool, like, liberal empire. All they would do was they would take the kings and the governors and people, and they would sit them in a tub. It was called tubbing someone. And it would be up to their neck. So if someone's standing up, we think of a tub where you sit down, like this would be a pool more like. They'd stand up to their neck in water, and they would paint honey all over your face so that horseflies would come and literally eat the flesh off your face. Then the Persians come along, and the Persians are known for being, now we're up to the 6th century, when King Cyrus of Persia in 539 BC, when he takes over, and they're known for being relatively lenient. They're kind of like the cool, like, liberal empire. All they would do was they would take the kings and the governors and people, and they would sit them in a tub. It was called tubbing someone. And The Babylonians, and then I think the Persians learned this from them as well. They would put you on a pike, and when I mean like put you on a stake, I don't mean like tie your hands to a stake. I mean they would put you on a stake, and they would do it in such a way that the stake carefully navigated around your internal organs so you could stay alive for as long as possible. Some of the parents are like looking at their little kids like, should we even be here right now? And some of the little kids are like, yeah, like tell me more. This is awesome. My dad used to have a book on like ancient forms of torture, and I'd like look through it, and your brain would get more and more distorted as you'd like flip through the pages. So I'll stop now. But that's basically how the ancient world was, and then the Greeks took over for the Persians, and then the Romans took over for the Greeks, and importantly, Tiberius, who's the emperor around the time Jesus is born, he and Julius Caesar right before him are kind of like neck and neck. Historians debate on which one crucified the most people. Julius Caesar, I think, was the emperor when, like, have you ever seen the movie Spartacus? When 1,000 slaves were all crucified along the same road going into Rome to prove a point about slave revolt. Tiberius did basically the same. He would, I'll let you use your imagination for this one, but he would, if there were someone who didn't want to serve in the military or who had deserted during a time of war, Tiberius would take the young man and make it impossible for him to go to the bathroom and then keep feeding him wine. Insane. And so all of that's a really ghoulish way simply to prove the point that when people say, yeah, I know that the Bible says God is about standing up to violence with love, but we have real problems now, right? They didn't have real problems back then when the Bible was written. I know that Jesus is about the way of forgiveness and overcoming power through this strength of weakness. And I know that Jesus is totally about nonviolence in the face of absolute brutality. But that was back then. We have real problems right now, right? Actually, the reality is just the opposite. They had real problems back then. Like the world has never actually been safer or more peaceable now. It's never been more peaceable than it is now. As much as a lot of people are making a lot of big money in media to scare us and to convince us otherwise, the world has never been safer. And so it's against this backdrop of this incredibly brutal ancient world that Isaiah proposes, second Isaiah, this is during the Babylonian exile, and this is just after the entire half the society, the people that were educated and usable to the Babylonians, were carted off in the exile. Everyone else was either slaughtered or left behind, left for dead in a destroyed home back in Israel. And when they were carted off to exile, they were taken across the desert, and this would have taken months to make this journey up around the river bend that goes up through the northern kingdoms, back down to the ancient Sumer in Babylon. Men, women, and children dragging themselves while the Babylonians rode on carts, right? And basically slave drivers were leading them on this death journey to Babylon. And it was so grueling that we have, if you want to go look at Psalm 137, this probably was a psalm that was written just after this journey, this kind of like ancient trail of tears. And the people are saying that the Babylonians are kind of like mocking them as they sit by the waters outside Babylon. And they're saying, come on, you Israelites, you love to sing about your God. Why don't you sing a song for us? You love singing so much. Sing for us. Come on. And they're saying, how can we sing a song to our God when we've been carted away from everything we've ever known, and there seems to be no help in sight from any God of any sort? And then the psalm closes with, happy are those who can bash the heads of their enemies' babies against a rock. So that's the emotional state of the people of Israel when 2nd Isaiah speaks. And he says, "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights." Makes it sound like he's talking about an individual, but understand that it's not uncommon to speak of the entire nation of Israel as God's servant. So he's speaking of Israel and how they as a nation together, as a community, are going to overcome what they're facing right now. "I've put my spirit upon him. He'll bring forth justice to the nations. He'll not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. A dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he's established justice in the earth. And the coastlands wait for his teaching." And skipping ahead, "I've given you," speaking directly to the nation of Israel now, "I've given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." The former things that have come to pass is this way of being in which my clan fights your clan, and the strongest one gets the spoils. My tribe fights your tribe, and the strongest one gets the spoils. My kingdom fights your kingdom, and the strongest one gets the spoils. My empire overtakes your empire and humiliates your people, and the strongest one gets the spoils. And my nation builds a bigger bomb than your nation, and the only uneasy peace we have is this thing called mutually assured destruction, where we know that we can both blow up the entire face of the globe 700 times over, and we call that peace. Those are the former things that have come to pass. And Yahweh says to the people, "I declare to you a new way of being, a way of love." How are you going to overcome the brutality and the anger and the violence of the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans, and it goes on and on and on? You're going to do it by softening your voice so lightly that it won't even be heard crying out in the streets. You're going to be so gentle that you're not even going to break a bruised reed, the weakest little reed growing up in a pond. You'll barely breathe a breath of force on this earth. And in that way, you're going to change the game. Now, of course, did Israel succeed at this? Right? Did they say, "No, yeah, okay, that makes sense. We're gonna just, when people want to hurt us, we're just going to let them hurt us. And we're going to tell them how much we love them in the process," right? No, of course they didn't. They failed at this over and over and over. Fortunately, the Christians came along and got it right. Yeah. But there was one who came along, and he reads this part of 2nd Isaiah, and he probably has it memorized. He's been raised in a synagogue, we know, since he was at least 12 years old, and he's been hearing this recited over and over and over. And he looks specifically at this part about opening up the sight of the blind, the sight of people who have been so blinded by this dog-eat-dog, out-compete, out-consume, beat up, mutually assured destruction, build bigger bombs, build bigger military, bigger force, we're going to defeat them. In his whole childhood, what he's heard is, "I'm going to open up the sight of the blind. I'm going to proclaim release to the captives, release to the people who have been taken into exile, release to the exilers who are so captive to their way of seeing the world that there's no joy anymore in life for them. It's just, who can I overtake next? Who can I overcome? How can I expand my empire? He looks at this part of Isaiah and he adopts it as his manifesto, his mission statement. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then everyone got it, and they said, "Jesus, that sounds like a really good idea." Anyone remember what happens right after Jesus says those words? They try to force him off a cliff, right? They try to take him out and push him out there. This guy's talking about things that we don't like very much. Good news to the poor. Shouldn't they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and work hard like the rest of us? Release to the captives. Well, why are they captive if they had obeyed the law like those of us who made good law-abiding choices in life? Proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee. Have you heard that language before? Debt forgiveness. It's not some namby-pamby, like, don't worry, God forgives you, like touched by an angel nonsense. Like, this is literally like the people who have taken over your family's land and your livelihood into debt slavery, forgiving you, giving back your land, and replacing this. This would be comparable if Chase Bank and Nationwide and all of them said, yeah, all of you people who've accumulated all this credit card debt because you made a bunch of bad decisions, forgiven. And we laugh because we're like, no, that's ridiculous. That would be an economic catastrophe if suddenly all the debt holders decided to forgive. And that's what Jesus is saying. Yeah, economic catastrophe. Your entire system would come crumbling down if everyone forgave everyone everything. Not in some cloudy, figurative, religious way, but in a literal way, like, I'm giving back the money you owe me. And Jesus doesn't make a lot of friends this way. And significantly, he dies in the most brutal way possible by one of the most brutal empires possible at one of the times where this method of dying is iconic for outcasts, outsiders, losers, people who don't fit within the grain of what we're trying to do as a strong nation together. And so when he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," I don't think he's just talking about the people standing directly in front of him. I think he's talking about this entire sweep of human history. This survival of the fittest way of seeing the world that we all love so much until we happen not to be the fittest for one reason or another. And he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not the way of being." And we would have completely and totally forgotten this man Jesus if all he had done was died. Because thousands of people died on a cross, right? You've heard this. Thousands of people died. History and tombs are littered with people who died on crosses, executed by the Roman government. We remember Jesus today because God validated, yes, his way is the way that lasts. Only his way of speaking so softly and tenderly to people that even enemies can be made friends. His way of not bruising even a bruised reed and snapping it in two because of how gentle his touch is in his way of leading. That's the way that endures to eternal life. So we can continue talking angrily at one another. We can continue saying, well, I know that it was good back then to talk about things like peace and love or whatever, but we have real problems. We got to deal with ISIS, right? We can do that. We just can't say that it's Christian to fight force with force, power with power, violence with violence, the same old story that has been told a million times over, and it is so boring. Through the sheer repetition, this is the boringest, most redundant story. God says, I introduce to you a new thing. Amen.